everyone. So my name is Ciro Continisio, and I'm going to talk about some improvements that we have in timeline that came to timeline between 18.3 and 19.1. So I call this talk Blending Gameplay and Storytelling because, of course, you can use timeline for cinematic experience such as The Heretic, which you might have seen in the Unity keynote. But I'm a game designer. I like to use timeline in my games. And that's why I like to blend gameplay and storytelling with it. And timeline is really flexible. It really allows you to do that very well. So the improvements that we have a few things. One of them is quite bigger than the others, and it's the markers and signals, which are available as of 19.1. And then we have some improvements on the track offset of the animator track. We can do control track nesting as well. And then we have some improvements on the audio track, on the control of audio tracks. So I'll guide you through all of this. The first one, so markers are something that people were asking for a while. We call them markers. They are basically timeline events, right? But we didn't call them events because we already have events in timeline. We already have events in Unity, so we don't want to generate confusion. And also because markers are actually a deeper thing. So markers are the technology, and then events are built on top of that. So markers give you the ability to mark an instant in time on a timeline, and they are basically opposed to clips. Clips are something that spans a certain amount of time, which are not good for events. Clips give you control over like start, then you have kind of like an update loop, and then you have the end, right? While markers are executed at a specific point in time. I also want to remind you that timeline, and this is something that confuses some people, timeline is not a frame-based tool, meaning that in timeline you put things on at a specific time. You don't put things on like a specific frame. You can reason in frames, but the reality is that Unity is a tool that works with a variable frame rate. So it doesn't really make sense to think this thing is going to be executed at frame 60. No, because frame 60 might be 1 second in, or it might be 2 seconds in. You don't know, depending on how your game is running. So timeline is time-based, and that's why you always should think of everything you do in timeline with time and not really frames. Which means that markers are not executed when the playhead is on the marker, but is executed when the playhead is past it, right? So when the playhead has passed that time. Anyway. So as I said, markers is a generic concept. They are just used to mark a specific point in time. And then we have signals, which are kind of like a special type of markers that allows to create events. And signals are made of 3 parts. They're made of 3 parts because the timeline team thought it would be nice to separate things rather than, do you know the animation events on animation clips? Who's familiar with that? Yeah, pretty much everyone. Animation events are kind of like markers, but they are tightly bound to the function that they're calling. So you define the function on the marker, and that means that you cannot really decouple that. So with signals, you can do that. And it's, as I was saying, 3 parts. You have a signal emitter on the timeline, which is the marker itself. And you put it there, you move it where you want, and that thing is going to propagate a notification to another object. Then you have an asset, this one. It's called just signal, and basically that acts as a channel. So when the timeline meets a marker, it will propagate that notification on that channel, and then you have a component which receives the signal, and depending if it's listening on the channel or not, can then attach an action to that. And this component can be anywhere in your scene. So let me give you a brief example through a demo that I created. So in this demo, and actually I think it's better if I play it. Yeah, so I have 2 timelines, basically. One is at the beginning, and it's this one. It shows like a little animation. Then this Viking like throws 2 units, and the other one replies with 2 units. They fight with each other, and then gameplay starts. And now, from this point, I'm able to play the game by playing these cards. So it's basically a Clash Royale clone that I made in 3 weeks. So as you can see, I play the cards and I generate units, right? So, but I wanted to embed some narration into this game. So now as I overwhelm the enemy army, they will destroy the tower, and then you have one final timeline which shows the destruction of the tower. Right, so I have a timeline at the beginning and a timeline at the ending. And I need to blend the storytelling with my gameplay and tap into it. So I have two timelines, and I'm using marker quite extensively. So this is one, it's called intro timeline. I select it, I go to the timeline panel. I want to remind you, timeline panel has a little lock icon. You can lock, and that allows you to basically select other objects while you're still working on this timeline. So once I've done that, you see here I have some markers, like this one. If I select it, you see here in the inspector that this is telling me where the marker is in time, and then I can make it retroactive, meaning that even if the timeline starts after this marker, it will still be played. I can make it emit only once, meaning that if the timeline loops, the marker will only be played once, so you have a lot of control. And so this marker will broadcast this signal, and as you can see, in this case, it's on a specific type of track, which is called signals track. So this is a track where you can only place signals, and then you see it has a bound object. You can provide any object in the scene, so you're basically sending these notifications somewhere. And I created an object here. I called it timeline signal relayer, which has the component that I mentioned before, so the signal receiver. So this signal receiver will receive the notifications, and then as you can see here, for each one of the channels that I have, I can define one or more listeners through the familiar interface of the Unity action. And then I can bind functions to this. So that's the decoupling that I was talking about. So I have timeline does something, spits out the signal, somebody picks it up and calls something else that happens. So in this case, for example, the intro timeline has a signal a signal emitter which broadcasts on the signal called start match, which means that the timeline signal relayer will, on start match, will call the game manager and start the match, which is what happens when the initial intro finishes and then the match starts. So that's how you can bridge the two things together. And that makes it super handy because now, if I have this thing, which should have been locked, I don't know why it's not locked, if, say, for example, a designer or an artist wants to make this cutscene longer, they can literally do it just by extending, like any click that they have, and then they move the marker, and everything is kept in sync, which is the point of having events on the timeline. I want to undo this. The other option you have, so this track here, which is a dedicated track, allows you to bind the notification to send them to an object which is anywhere in the scene, as I said, and you connect it here. The other option you have is to actually use any of the tracks that already have an object and add the markers directly onto these ones. So for example, this is an animation track. I could potentially right-click here and add a signal emitter on the track. And then this signal will be sent to this object here. So this object now needs to have the component that I mentioned before, right? Which is something you might want, something you don't want. It depends on like the situation in your game. If this notification is tightly coupled with that object, then it makes sense to have it there. If it's something more generic that you reuse across different timelines, then it makes sense to have it on another object, right? Third option that you have is a track that is here. It's actually a dedicated marker track that belongs to the timeline itself. And you can also add markers here. So you can have them in 3 different places, and that determines who receives that notification. In this case, it's going to be the timeline itself that gets it. So if I place a marker here, I'm going to undo. The object that gets notified is the same one that's playing this timeline, which means is the one that has the playable director, right? So here I would have to add a receiver. I'm not going to do it because, as I said, I have this centralized I called it timeline signal relayer object. Is it clear up to this point? Yeah? Okay, so events are actually called signals. They rely on markers, and they can broadcast, and they are decoupled. You can attach them to any function in your game. Then another cool possibility, which mirrors what you can do with clips, is the ability to create your custom markers. So in this case, you basically provide two scripts. You provide one that defines the marker itself, and then you provide one that is a receiver. And you can also actually piggyback on the signals and extend them, but I did something different. I went to the marker class and extended that. So I built everything from scratch. And I want to show you the code actually. So this is the class for the marker. Super, super simple. You see it extends from marker, and then it starts implementing the data that I want that marker to have. In my case, for my game, what I wanted to do was to tap into the gameplay of the game. So you've seen how I can play cards, right? So I want Timeline to be able to play cards for me. And it needs just three things. It needs what card, where on the playing field, and which faction does that card belong to, the player or the opponent. So the marker stores that data, right? Timeline, when it meets the marker, sends the notification to this other class, which again is super simple, inherits from mono behavior because it's a component, and implements iNotificationReceiver, and it implements this function on notify. So this function, it does only one thing. It unpacks the data that it gets from the marker, and then it calls the relevant script that has to act. In this case, the game manager. So it taps into this function, use card, and it passes the data. And then the game manager plays the card exactly the same way as if the player did. So the result is exactly the same. And that's why, if you look at the, let me do it again. If you look at the result, you see, 2 units get spawned here, and he scoffs, and then 2 units get spawned here, and they start fighting each other, and this is basically pure gameplay. So now I have this bridge between the narration and the gameplay. And actually, you see now these units are being killed by another unit that the AI has spawned, and then gameplay continues. So I think this is the very powerful stuff that I've done over and over again with Timeline, is this ability to integrate narration and gameplay. The markers are here, as you can see. They have a slightly different shape to show you that there's something custom compared to this one, which is just a regular signal. If I select the marker, in the inspector, I have, didn't update. In inspector, I have the data that I mentioned before, right? The card, the position where the card is played, and the faction it belongs to. So it totally taps into my gameplay loop and just provides the data as if the player had played that card, or the AI, if you want. And now I have the ability to move these markers back and forth to change that behavior. Another example where I used markers is on this destruction timeline at the end. In this destruction timeline, I have an animation that plays, and here at the end I have a signal that calls for the on end game, so it shows the UI that allows me to reset the game. And here at the beginning, actually, I have another notification which speaks with Cinemachine. Have you ever used Cinemachine? The Cinemachine, this camera system that we have now, it has a module to do camera shake. And with this marker, I just basically send an impulse to the camera shake module so that on this animation, the camera also shakes. Right? So I'm tapping into Cinemachine to drive that, rather than having to animate the camera shake by hand. And that's it for signals. I hope it was a clear explanation. Then back to the other improvements. These are kind of minor, if you want. Oops, sorry. The other improvements I mentioned are nested control tracks. So control tracks, I don't know if you know, I always like to explain things from scratch. They are a track that allow to take control of something else. So control tracks are like this, look like this. They're a track that has no bound object. You bind the object here on the clip, and you say, I want to take control of this distraction object. And what they do is they take control of either another timeline or a particle system or any other object that has a concept of timing. And so when this timeline plays, the control track plays that object at the same time, so that you're able to basically scroll and see, for example, this animation play on the other object with the same timing. Right? This is control tracks. Now the improvement is that now I can double click on the control track and see the other timeline contextually here, even with, you see, the limiter that shows me how much the control track, how long is the control track. So I see how much of this timeline I'm using in the in the parent timeline. So you can now nest timelines into each other, and the top one is controlling this one, which is controlling this one, and you can dive and inspect the other one, make changes contextually, and as you scrub, you see all of them playing together, and you have much more context. So this is something new that I think was added in 18.3. The other improvements, we have more control over animation tracks for positioning objects. So now if you select an animation track, you see here, for example, this one is driving the animation on the Viking on top of the tower. So it's playing an animation clip, specifically the die animation, and it's moving the character. But then the new added control is here on the track. If you select the track, you will see here now you have the ability to go either with scene offsets, transform offsets, or auto. Now, if you used timeline before, the default behavior was auto. And it was something that relied on the interaction between the animator on the character and timeline, and it was a bit confusing. So we improved that, and now you have these two extra options, which are super simple. Scene offset means whatever the offset is in the scene, I'm going to use that. And transform offset means I'm going to use this one instead. And then you're able to define an offset for the character or the object that you're animating just for this track, which is very useful if you're recycling animations, or maybe you're doing some cuts and you want the object to suddenly be somewhere else, then you can do transform offsets here. And then if you're migrating from an older version of Unity to this one, your tracks will be on auto, because that's the compatibility option. But you're free to change it to scene offsets or transform offsets. Don't forget that even if this is a track control, so this is for the whole track, then you can always go on each clip and add an additional offset on top. It's an option. I'm not saying that you should do it, but it's an option that's there. And when you use these offset match fields, it means that if you're working with multiple clips, they will try to match the offset of the previous one. So if you have a character that's playing a walking animation, the next clip you place is going to have an offset that starts from the end of the previous clip. So everything is kind of seamless and trying to help you in every way. But you always have control over these offsets. Final improvement that I wanna mention, and I'm very sorry that I'm not gonna be able to demo it properly because it's audio, and there's really no point in demoing audio in this noisy environment. But basically now, if you have an audio track, before you could already do this, you could bind an audio source, but now, let me create an audio source. So you have an audio source in your scene that's playing some clip, whatever. You can bind this into the timeline, and now on the track you have control for volume, stereo pan, and spatial blend. And the funny thing is, these things, they still speak with the audio source and they blend together. So say the audio source has some kind of volume, and you decrease this volume here on the track, then timeline tells you the final volume is 0.64 here and 0.5 there, and the final volume is this number here. So through the timeline you have a visual on what's happening between the interaction between the track and the audio source that you're using to drive that specific music or effects. So as you see, as I change these values, they get recapped here directly onto timeline. Okay. That's it. This is all I have for the improvements on timeline. There are some minor improvements, UX stuff, and there's a lot of work the team is doing to port timeline to job system and ECS, so they're basically making it much more performant. But that's going to come under the hood. You're not even going to see it. It's just going to run faster. So this is all from me. Do you have questions? I have another 9 minutes. And if you have questions, you don't have questions. Okay. You have one question. There's a microphone.
So with control tracks, I noticed one of the things you can do is you can actually drag a prefab onto the control track, such as a prefab with a emitter system and whatnot, and it will actually spawn that prefab in temporarily during the timeline sequence.
Yes.
But what I don't know is like how performant is that if I'm switching out different timeline sequences. Say I've got a character that could run 6 potential ones to like hook up skills and whatnot. Like, how realistic is it to use that for spawning in and out prefabs, or should I be creating my own pooling system with the signals to do that?
Well, it really depends on the use case, but one thing I can tell you is, I'm going to do it now. From game objects. So I added a control track with a clip that spawns, as you can see, a prefab, a rock. Now, one thing I know about timeline is that when you press play, the timeline spawns the object on activation. So it is pre-spawned, right? So that's something that you can keep in mind if you have I don't know. It really depends, like, when this timeline is activated. If it's in a critical point in time in your gameplay, then of course it makes more sense to pre-spawn that object when you can, but you can afford that loading, and then play the timeline later on.
Yeah, because I noticed there was like on when you're defining tracks, there's like the prepare data function that gets called in the back end when it's like setting up that sequence for that playable. And I'm just wondering if there's a way to like force that on those playables. So I know I might play these 6. Can I preload data for these 6?
I don't remember the API 100%, but I think there's 2 stages. There's one stage that prepares the data and is when the timeline. I mean, one thing you can do is you can basically play the timeline without actually starting it, and that will trigger all of the creation of all these assets. So kind of like pre-warm it for you, and then you play it when you want. That's one way. Because I mean, if timeline is playing, right? And when I say playing, I mean what happens here when I press preview, right? That's played, but it's not moving. It's not doing anything, so that it has no cost. So maybe that's one way.
Okay. Thank you.
If then the thing gets tough and you are playing different timelines and they're all spawning a lot of objects, then maybe it makes sense to have some kind of pooled objects already somewhere that you just activate in.
Cool, thank you.
No worries. Other questions? No? One question.
You showed us that you can manipulate audio source. Is this any possibility to manipulate some values at the audio mixer?
Yes, I mean, the audio source will be connected to the audio mixer. So, if I add the audio source here, and actually I have no audio clips here in this. Yeah, I have one. So I mean, this clip is being played, right? And then the track sends it to the audio source. Then if the audio source is routed through an audio mixer, then yes, you can totally use all of the audio mixer functionality for that clip.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Okay, if you have no more questions, then I'll leave the stage for the next speaker. Thank you.